So welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the to my favorite of all seminar series, of course, the Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. I've been coming along to these since the very beginning, which is 3 years ago now, and I'm delighted to now be in the position of co-hosting. And I have this honor of co-hosting along with Alan Blackman, and we alternate months as to who takes the hot seat each month. And this month it's my turn. But just as important are the core team of helping organize these seminars. And you'll be meeting Elias later, who'll be chairing the Q&A. But also in the background, we have Alex and Renzo, who've done a lot of work in pulling these seminar series together. Just to remind you that these seminars are organized by the Impact Evaluation Working Group of the Society for Conservation Biology. I'd really encourage you to check out our website. We have a brand new website built expertly by Alex. And there you can find all the last 3 years of seminars beautifully linked. And that is really a treasure trove of information. If you're ever at a loose end of something to listen to, I listen to them on walks or when I'm doing the washing up. And if they're really excellent, I go back with my notebook and watch them again and take notes. But there's an absolute treasure trove there. So I encourage you to make use of them. There's also opportunities to volunteer in the Impact Evaluation Working Group. So if you're got some skills that you'd like to share, then please join us. Today, our seminar is being given by Nick Salafsky, who's the director and founder of Foundations for Success. And he's been a key player in the Conservation Measures Partnership for many years. He's also absolutely fundamental to the development of the Miradi software, which many conservation organizations use to implement the open standards framework, to plan conservation projects and measure their success. His talk today is called The Role of the Gold Standard versus the Aluminium Standard, Impact Assessment in Conservation Practice. So we're expecting a talk about, I think, pragmatism over perfection. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us. But as a reminder, all previous talks are available online. There's now last month's excellent seminar by Ben Groom is up, and I'd really encourage you to check that one out. So just quick housekeeping. I'll hand over to Nick in just 1 minute. He will present for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. Now, we want to make this as interactive as possible. This is a community, and it's nice to get to know each other. So please unmute, if called on to ask a question, unmute and speak. Elias will be chairing that, but equally you can post questions in the chat, say who you are as well, and we are recording as well. So I think with no further ado, I will introduce Nick. So over to you, Nick. I'll stop sharing and please share your screen.
All right. Let me make sure I get the right screen here. Okay, thanks, Julia. Thanks, Alex. Thanks to the rest of the organizing team. And thanks, everyone, for showing up today. I appreciate the opportunity to talk and share with this work. So the title of this presentation is The Gold Standard versus the Aluminum, or I guess if we want to be British, Aluminium Standard for Program Adaptive Management. And you can see here I've put versus, but I hope you'll see where we're actually going to end up is it's not about versus, it's about and. So the gold standard and the aluminum standard. So I want to start with My Recurring Nightmare, which is a play in 3 brief acts. Act 1, Nick. We recommend that your program adopt intervention monitoring to help assess whether your actions are leading to your desired outcomes, aka your theory of change holds. Program director, let me talk to my organization's evaluation expert about this. Act 2, program director, what do you think of this proposed intervention monitoring approach? Org evaluation experts, well, if they are not recommending gold standard experimental impact assessments against a control group, we won't be able to determine true impact. So I don't think it's any good. Act 3, program director to Nick. My evaluation expert says that what you're proposing is not best practice. So I don't think we'll go with the intervention monitoring approach. But since we don't have the skills, time, or money, we won't do an impact assessment either. Bwahahaha. And the end result is the program doesn't do any monitoring. It's business as usual, random acts of conservation. So that's my nightmare. A little bit about us, Foundation to Success. We are a not-for-profit organization. We have been around about 25 years. Our mission is to amplify the collective impact of the global conservation community. We have folks in different parts of the world. We provide training and coaching, develop frameworks and tools, facilitate collaborative learning, and build capacity of the future. Our unofficial tagline is we don't actually implement conservation work, but we do try to make other people's work better. We're also part of something bigger, and a bunch of folks on this call are also part of it, the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. As most of you probably know, CMP, one of its primary things is to be the steward of the open standards for the practice of conservation, which are a series of best practices for conservation work. First version came out way back in 2004, version 2 in 2007, version 3 in 2013, version 4 in 2000, and version 5 in just this last year. And so these are the set of standards for doing better conservation work. It's a cycle that many of you are probably familiar with, but it informs a lot of the work that we do. And then also a lot of the thinking that I'm going to be sharing today comes from a book I worked on with my colleague Richard Margolius called Pathways to Success. And when we were organizing that book and thinking about it, we wanted to talk about how programs function. And when we talked about doing that book, we talked about the steps that a program goes through, coming up with their situation assessment, thinking through what their strategies are, and then thinking through how they're going to implement that work over time. But what we also found here was, is that monitoring doesn't come at the end of that cycle, but really there's an evidence base that's sort of a cloud that sits around that program work and infuses it over its lifetime. And so that evidence actually comes in during the design phase, but when you're synthesizing existing information, it comes in when you're tracking what happened through monitoring, evaluation, or research. And then it also comes in about collaborative learning. And so it's really kind of thinking about evidence in these many different ways. One of the concepts in the book, and this is the title of the talk, is about what we call the aluminum standard. And what we found in this thinking about this is that if you think about your investment in evidence acquisition and analysis, so whether you're collecting existing evidence or whether you're doing monitoring to collect future evidence, that if you look about the investment level and you look at and put that against the probability of making the correct decision as a team, if you do zero investment, your chance of, well, you might get lucky at point A, but you have a low probability of making the correct decision. If you do a little bit of thinking and work, you might get up to point B pretty quickly and start to hone in on the right answer. As you then do more and more work, you get to point C where you optimize your probability of the correct decision. Then maybe things get a bit confused, and then you finally come down to point E, which is planning paralysis, and nothing happens. And what we found here within this is that you can think about if you're in a high level of proof situation, if it really matters, you probably want to maximize your chance of a correct decision by using gold standard analytical approaches. So people hold out that you want to approach the gold standard. But if you look at the shape of that curve, it's pretty expensive to get up there to that top level bit. And so maybe in most cases, or certainly in many cases, it's probably better to maximize your return on investment by using aluminum standard analytical approaches that are lightweight, inexpensive, and flexible. And so the question is, when do we use the gold standard and when do we use the aluminum standard? And that's a lot of what I want to be talking about. So in this talk, I want to do two things: propose a framework for combining gold standard and aluminum standard approaches to program monitoring, adaptive management, and learning, and then discuss if this group is willing to support this framework going forward. And you don't have to, but we'll see where we end up at the end of this talk. I want to start with some basic concepts because I think it's important that we're all on the same page about how we talk about things. So we talk about strategy pathways as the basic unit of conservation work, sometimes called a theory of change. And it really outlines if you have an action, something that you're doing, it's going to lead to some intermediate results, maybe a threat reduction outcome, and then ultimately the outcome, your target outcome, what you care about ultimately. So it's a set of factors that show how your actions lead to your outcomes. You can put on them the specific activities that you're doing to change that world. So I'm going to call sometimes actions or activities, but in the context of this talk, I may also call them interventions. It's the things that you're doing to change the world. You can also put them on your goals and objectives and your indicators, so they're attributes of a factor and form the basis of your monitoring evaluation plan. In the conservation standards, we usually use the word goal to talk about the ultimate thing that you're trying to accomplish, and objectives are those shorter term things that you're trying to do en route. And then most critically, if you think about having this theory of change, you can also hang on it the assumptions that you're making that you can then assess with evidence. And we'll come back to that more over time. So when we talk about evidence, there's a lot of different words and things that are out there, but we found it helpful to make the following definitions. An analytical question is something that we need to know about a system. What we originally called a hypothesis and then a claim, but to be simpler, we're now going to call an assumption, is something that we believe to be true about a system, often a more detailed, accessible articulation of an analytical question of interest. And evidence is the relevant data, information, knowledge, and wisdom used to assess an assumption. So it's all that stuff that's out there that you're using to see whether that assumption holds. Coming back to those words, hypothesis and claim, we're going to be a little bit more specific about them. Under the broad category of assumption, we can subdivide those into claims, which is an assumption about a system that is supported by existing evidence, whereas a hypothesis is an assumption about a system that requires new evidence from future evidence synthesis, monitoring, collaborative learning, or research. And then finally, we're going to talk about specific assumptions, which is a proposition about a specific case situation. So you're dealing with an actual project or an actual thing you're doing in the world, and that's a specific assumption. Whereas a generic assumption is a proposition about a generic case, which is often a composite of many specific case situations. So those are some words just to keep in mind as I use them going forward. And what's really interesting is that we found is that these analytical questions assumptions, they link evidence, monitoring, and learning. So you can think about a temporal axis where you're using existing evidence, and then you can think about acquiring and generating new evidence. You can also think about a vertical axis, the scope axis, where you can think about work that's inside your program or project where you're working versus outside the project or program where you're working. And in this quadrant, you have the specific evidence base, which is specific claims using existing evidence about your program that you're working on. In this quadrant, we have the generic evidence base, which are generic claims about how the world works generally based on what the world's already done and knows. In this quadrant, we have program monitoring, which is you're testing specific hypotheses in the context of your work. And in this quadrant, we have collaborative learning, where you're testing generic hypotheses about the world more generally. And what you'll see is that research is a piece of the forward-looking, acquiring, and generating new evidence space, but it's not the entire space. There's retrospective evaluation and prospective evaluations as part of that space. And what happens is that over time, as you do monitoring, that accretes and becomes part of the specific evidence base or part of the generic evidence base over time. And that's the learning process that happens. So we're going to be really thinking about these different forms of evidence as we go through this conversation. So in terms of program monitoring, what I want to focus on first is quadrant 3. And that's the thing where we're specifying hypotheses about the project or program we're working on, and we're acquiring and generating new evidence to test whether what we're doing is working. So we're really going to focus on that specific quadrant. So of course, you all know, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, the critical question or a critical question is, does intervention X work? And by work, I mean, does it actually cause outcome Y? So you have an intervention that you're doing, you have an outcome that you want to achieve, and you're going to have a comparison or a control group. So you're either using an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design, but you have a comparison or control group where you want to see what happens in that as well. And of course, the reason we're going to the trouble of setting all that up, doing that gold standard work, is that you have the case where the outcome works in the intervention, it doesn't work in the comparison control, and therefore we can conclude the intervention works. And of course, then there's the other case, and this is what we're guarding against, the case where the outcome works with the intervention, but it also works with the comparison or control group, so therefore we're no evidence that the intervention works. We're avoiding type 1 error by having that comparison or control group and really able to answer that question, does intervention X work? But the trouble, in my opinion, with this approach is that there's another case that's pretty interesting. And it's the case where you do your intervention, it doesn't work, but your comparison or control group doesn't work as well. And in that case, all you're left with is a bunch of questions. Okay, it didn't work, but why didn't it work? And what can we learn, or how could we fix it, or how could we make it better? And if all we're doing is doing the classic does intervention X work against a comparison control, we really don't have that information at that to understand why it didn't work. And unfortunately, in conservation, this is often the case. Things don't work. And so I think that we're a little fooled by maybe the medical analogies, because in the medical world, they really just, they would move on to the next treatment. But we don't have that luxury in conservation. We have to understand why our intervention didn't work and maybe figure out how to fix it. So there's actually another question that I think we need to be thinking about, and that's the question of why did intervention X not work, which you could also rephrase as how do we adapt and improve? And so in this case, it's back to this thing, but what we're going to have to start to do is unpack the dreaded black box of mechanism. And so unpacking that black box, what we're going to do is we're going to look at that intervention, and we're going to look at the long-term outcome that we want to get to, but we're also going to look again at some of these intermediate results and the activities that we're doing. So we're going to unpack that black box and understand a priori, how did we think our intervention is going to lead to the outcome that we want to get to? And then we're going to ask what we call the 3 adaptive management questions in the conservation standard space. Did we do what we said we would do? Are we seeing the change in the system that we expected? And then what is the appropriate managed response? And so I want to take you through those. As one aside, though, the other thing about unpacking the black box that I won't spend a lot of time on, but that is pretty important, is it also allows us to measure shorter-term outcomes in cases where it may take years or even decades to see the final outcome. So if you're trying to restore a jaguar population and jaguars only have 1 cub every 3 years, it might take you 15 or 25 years to get to the final outcome. So we need those intermediate results and intermediate outcomes anyway to sort of measure our progress over time in conservation. But coming back to those 3 adaptive management questions, what that leads us to, if we unpack the black box, are 3 different cases in which we have this intervention that we're implementing. So the first case is we did the activities that we said we were going to do. We detect in our monitoring the results that we're expecting to see. We achieve the outcome we're expecting to see. And so what do we conclude? Success. In this case, it actually worked. Now, we are vulnerable to the type 1 error. So if all we're doing is this one case without a counterfactual control, yes, we are vulnerable to that type 1 error. But what we also have here is we have the case where, okay, we set out to do this work. In this case, we didn't do the activities that we set out to do. There's no change in the system, or change hasn't happened yet in the system. We're not reaching our outcome. And so that's a case of implementation failure. Something went wrong where we didn't even do the activities we set out to do. And unfortunately, this is really common in conservation. Maybe we didn't have the budget. Maybe we didn't have the staff capacity. Maybe a pandemic happened. Maybe a war broke out. But there's some reason we didn't do what we need to do. And the management response there is we need to fix that implementation failure. That's a very different failure than this case, where in this case here, what you see here is you have the same thing. In this case, you did your activities as scheduled, but you didn't see the change in the system that you were expecting to see. And as a result of that, you're not seeing the outcome you were expecting to see. And in this case, what we might conclude is we had a theory failure. Either we had the wrong intervention, or maybe we had the right intervention, but the world has then since changed. But we have a theory failure. And the remedy for this is to figure out something else to do or how we're going to fix that particular problem. So again, we do care about the question of did the intervention work, but this other question of why did intervention X not work is also important and one that we need to think about. What you really might get to is you get to the mixed case here, where you have some activities working, some things not working, some things partially working. So those are the mixed failure reasons. This is probably the most common, and you need to sort of debug that and figure out what's going on. But to do that, what we need to do is then assess specific sub-assumptions within the overall theory of change. It's not the drug case where we're just saying we're going to apply this drug and see if the patient or the lab animal is cured. What we really need to understand is each of these sub-assumptions within this black box of mechanism, what's going on and what needs to happen. And here's the really critical point that I want to make. Each sub-assumption might benefit from a different monitoring design. So you might test some of these assumptions with a non-experimental design, some with a quasi-experimental, and some with an experimental. So when I'm talking about unpacking the black box, I'm not necessarily saying that we're ruling out counterfactuals or ruling out experimental methods. We have to find the right mix of these methods to test each of these assumptions that we're working on. So theories of change are really important to help break up complex questions into testable assumptions. A more specific example of this is, let's say we care about seabirds on an island. We're worried about nest predation from rats. So rats, our theory of change says we want to get that nest predation to acceptable level. We want to eliminate the rats from those key islands. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. So we want to rule out other sorts of nest predation. We want to rule out other threats to seabirds. But our intervention here is we're going to do rat control efforts. And so you can see the activities. We're going to do outreach to landowners. We're going to develop a plan for the islands. We're going to implement the controls. You can see some intermediate results that are happening here. Maybe there's also some work that we're going to do with biosecurity to keep new rats from reaching the islands. And there's some other activities that are going on. So this is a much more typical case where we're really kind of thinking about a strategy that involves multiple different activities or actions that we're taking on here. And what we can do is then articulate in this broad question, is rat eradication effective? We can break it up into a bunch of component hypotheses that we need to test. Traditional landowners will agree to rat control, so we can implement control efforts. Implementing rat control efforts will eliminate rats from the key islands. If rats are eliminated, seabird nest predation will be at acceptable levels. And these are all then testable with monitoring under different kinds of designs. And so we need to find the right monitoring design for each of these different assumptions. So what I want to give you here then is a decision tree for what level of investment we make in that program monitoring work. And the decision tree looks something like this. We start with a well-formulated specific assumption in a pathway. So we have to have that assumption in a pathway, in this case, a hypothesis. And the first question we're going to ask is this assumption critical to the pathway? And if the answer is no, it's not that critical, then we probably don't want to do any monitoring because we can't monitor everything. And so part of this is to sort of say, let's just not worry about it. It's just not that critical. But if it's a higher level of criticality, we're going to ask a second question. What's our confidence in the existing theory and evidence? So does the existing theory and evidence say that the intervention is likely to work or whatever we're going to do is going to work? Or are we less confident? So if we're very high confident, then let's get on with implementing the actions and let's just do a little bit of verification monitoring. Let's confirm the actions and verify expected outcomes. So the medical analogy here is if you have a broken arm, the doctor doesn't need to do tons and tons of tests. They're going to do an X-ray. They know how to do a cast. They know how to watch that cast is healing your arm over time. You don't need to do a lot of fancy work when you know that the treatment is going to work for the work that you're doing. But if you're less confident, then we're going to ask, well, what is the standard of proof scenario? Are you in a situation where you're dealing with the last remaining population of an endangered species? Are you in a situation where there's a lot of stakeholder attention to what you're doing? Are you in a situation where you're spending tons of money? If you're not, if you're in a low burden of proof situation, then you can probably do basic aluminum standard adaptive management. So you're going to track your actions and you're going to monitor your core results. But if you're in a higher burden of proof situation, then we're going to ask, well, how urgent is the action that we need to take? Do we need to take the action tomorrow or can we wait a few months? If we can do it, if it's a high burden of proof, high urgency, then we're going to use the fancier version of the aluminum standard and we're going to track actions and carefully monitor all our results over time. We're going to invest more in the adaptive management that we're doing. But if we have time and the luxury of time and we have the available budget, then in that case, we can bring in the gold standard research, do intensive research and our monitoring approaches. But if there's not a learning potential or less money, you might want to come back to the aluminum standard type of adaptive management. So we have this decision tree that says it's not that we use the aluminum standard or the gold standard, but we need to use the right one in the right places. So that's a little bit about program monitoring. I do want to talk about another form of learning, which is to me the collaborative learning side of this. So it's this quadrant down here. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that as well. And in the collaborative learning space, what we're doing is we're learning by iterating between, if you remember these terms, specific and generic pathways. So here's an example of, let's say we're working at one site in the Caribbean and we're worried about sea turtles. and their eggs are being collected on the beach illegally, and we want to have increased sea turtle nesting success. So we have this brilliant idea for an action that we're going to do there. We're going to have community guards on sea turtle nesting beaches. So you got the community guards here. And of course, our theory of change says that if we put the community guards out there, the guards will be deployed. If they're deployed, they will catch some egg collectors. More importantly, their presence will deter other egg collectors from being up on the beach. So illegal egg collecting will be reduced. We'll have increased sea turtle nesting success. So here's a case where we could then go out and monitor, and we could do this either using without a control group or with a control group we wanted. Depends how intensive we wanted to be about it. But we're going to monitor the situation and see what's happening. Let's go to a totally different part of the world. So now we're in Africa, and we care about pangolin poaching in some terrestrial reserve. And we're going to come up with a specific action that we're going to call community ranger patrols. So it's a slightly different name of that action. In this case, it's community ranger patrols. We're going to test that out. In this case, the theory of change looks pretty similar. Effective patrols are deployed. The patrols catch the poachers. Their presence deters the poachers. Illegal pangolin poaching is reduced. But in this case, we learn something different. We learn a little bit more that if the poachers are people's neighbors, then a community ranger patrol can safely confront them. But if the poachers are drug gangs armed with AK-47s, the patrols will literally be blown out of the water. So we're going to add a conditionality to this strategy here where patrols can safely confront the poachers. So we've learned something about this instance. So we've just gone through two totally different parts of the world, different biomes, one's terrestrial, one's marine, different cultures, different continents, different languages, different names for what the activity is. So everything about these systems is different. But you can see that actually it's really the same action that people are doing, or more, they're part of the same family. And so we can take these two case studies, maybe 15 or 20 other case studies from around the world, and we can analyze them, and we can actually come up with a generic strategy called community patrols and guards, and we can start to determine the conditions under which the strategy is going to work and not work. And so what we're doing is, if you think about the classic data, evidence, data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, so this is the case information that's being synthesized. What we're doing is we're synthesizing that case-specific evidence. Technically, we could actually do regression analyses or other forms of statistical controls to do that work. And then we're using that to create knowledge and wisdom, which can then create generic evidence that informs ongoing practice. And so there's this iteration so that even if you have the case where people are only monitoring without controls what they're doing, if they contribute their knowledge to this wider set of case studies, then we can use statistical control to really understand, to start to what works and what doesn't work. And so then that creates the evidence base for creating claims. We can then start to create the evidence where we can look at the direction of the effect. Is it positive evidence or negative evidence? We can look at the strength of the effect. Is there strong evidence or weak evidence? We can look at the reliability, more reliable, less reliable. And then really important, we can look at the relevance. Is the evidence relevant to a specific claim, or is less relevant evidence applies to a generic claim? And the reason this is important, Karl Popper talked about this 100 years ago. It avoids what he calls the induction fallacy. So we might have a rat eradication strategy that we show works on 100 different islands, and it works every time. But it might fail in my location, the 101st island, because maybe all those test islands were dry, and so you put out poison and the rats ate it. But my island was very rainy, and so therefore the poison washed away, and it didn't work in that case. So we really have to understand that conditionality about when things work and when they don't work. What it lets us do is then put out a balance here. We can weigh the collected evidence to build a claim. So we can say, here's the reliability. We can put these sources on the balance. The reliability talks about how much emphasis we should put on each source, regardless of the conclusion. The direction says which side of the balance do we put things on. The distance here is looking at how far from the balance we want to put it on either side. And then, of course, relevance is whether a source even belongs on this balance or should be taken off. We can weigh up all that evidence and sort of see whether the evidence supports what's now becoming from a hypothesis to a claim that we're building up over time. There's a fancier version of this that Alex Christie and some others worked on called the beam, where you actually create these nice little ziggurat plots, and you take all your evidence and you put on the balance and make all that work happen. So there's a lot more details about formulating and testing claims in a series of papers. Some of my colleagues from Canada were involved in this as well, where we were testing it with caribou in recovery work here. But there's a whole bunch of different papers here that are about formulating and testing claims. The last part I want to talk about here, though, is different learning designs for different types of actions. And so what you can see here is that the Conservation Measures Partnership, working with the IUCN Red List folks, the Species Survival Commission Red List folks, about in 2008, we came up with a standard lexicon for biodiversity conservation, which were unified classifications of threats and actions, with, in this case, particular emphasis on the actions. That is now being updated. CMP actually came up with version 2 in 2014, and we're about to finish version 4, which is going to be released hopefully in the next 6 months. But basically, there are different types of actions that we can think about. So one class of actions are what we call the direct management actions. So this is all the stuff that you do on the ground or in the ocean to directly manage the landscape or the seascape that you're in. So this could be pulling out invasive species. It could be controlled burns. It could be changing the flow patterns in dams. There's all that direct management action stuff that people do, which either directly restores a value, a conservation value, or it reduces a threat to that value. Then there's behavior change actions, which change human behaviors to either get them to do more of the things that we want them to do or get people to do less of the things that we don't want them to do. So that's the plus and the minus that you see there. And then behind that, there's a bunch of enabling condition actions that actually change the context so that other things happen and conservation happens. This is a list of the different actions at the next level. So what I showed you was the level 0. Direct management actions have 2 level 1s, and then there's level 2s and 3s underneath that: site area management restoration, species management restoration. The behavioral change actions have a bunch of different level 1s under them, and then the enabling condition actions are that you see here. Here's what's really interesting, kind of generically speaking. Direct management actions generally benefit from experimental controls. So they're much more the case where, like the drug testing case, where we want to see, does this herbicide work to control this in a certain application regime? Does it work to control this invasive species? And that works really nicely with experimental controls, those kinds of direct management actions. When you get to the more complicated behavioral change actions or the enabling condition actions, however, really you really can't see the change all the way through to the conservation values that you ultimately care about, the ultimate outcomes. And so you need to be sort of pooling your data and looking more at intermediate effects. And in particular, I'm going to just show you some examples. The Conservation Measures Partnership has just released some new thinking about how to think about behavior change in the context of conservation actions, some work we did with RARE and some other folks about looking at different levers for conservation. And so if you look at sort of the typical project theory of change, you have the activities and intermediate result. When we behaviorize this, we actually look at who are those actors, what is the behavior result that we want those actors to be doing, and in ahead of that, what is the psychosocial state that that actor is getting in based on the levers that we're using. And it could be the threat actor, but it could also be secondary actors in the system. To show you a slightly more complicated version of this, the old school way of dealing with sharks, so we cared about shark finning in Eastern Bay being curtailed. We're going to do a campaign to stop shark fin soup. And you can see that we would state that the campaign reaches key restaurants in capital city. The restaurants don't serve soup, reduce demand for shark fins in capital city. Then you have illegal shark fishing is curtailed. That leads to good things happening for the sharks. Behavior was implicit in this theory of change, but under the new approach, we're actually making it much more explicit. So we want to have illegal shark fishing reduced. So one thing is we want the fishers to choose sustainable fishing over shark fishing because their psychosocial result is that they perceive the cost of shark finning are greater than the benefits of shark finning. Behind that might be a whole outreach strategy. There's an ad campaign that it's not cool to serve shark fin soup. How does that actually work? Well, that is to get at demand, that consumers might feel emotional connection to sharks when they see that video. They might feel judged when serving soup to their guests in a wedding. So they choose not to serve shark fin soup at events, so demand decreases. The banquet hall owners might feel that serving shark fin soup is bad for their business, so they remove it as a featured option on their menus. There's a whole enforcement strategy here where we conduct patrols and arrest and fine illegal fishers. So therefore, fishers will realize they'll be caught and have to pay fines. So that leads to the real cost of supplying shark fin increasing. And then you could even apply those behavior levers to changing the policies, taking the legislators on a field trip. You show them what's going on. They know more about shark finning. They enact the laws banning shark finning in the national waters. But what you can see here is a whole bunch of different intermediate results And what we could do is we could start to test whether a ad campaign leads to consumers feeling an emotional connection. But the interesting thing is we don't have to take it all the way through to the shark population. All we need to do is test some of these intermediate behaviors and intermediate psychosocial results. And we might look at ad campaigns in different contexts, one in the context of hunting leopards in Africa and one in shark finning. And so we can start to really understand how things are working through a combination of aluminum standard and gold standard research designs to see what's happening. Okay, I promised to be done. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that the problem is not the gold standard versus the aluminum standard. So it's not about, there's a time and a place when we want to optimize and use the gold standard. Many other cases, we want to use the aluminum standard. So it's not versus, it's business as usual with no monitoring, adapting, or learning. That's the problem. So we shouldn't be fighting each other and saying, we should use the gold standard, we should use the aluminum standard. Let's stop that kind of debate and let's get to a place where we're actually uniting forces and sort of saying, hey, it's all those other people out there who are doing no monitoring, adapting, or learning who are really the problem. And let's see if we can work together to solve that particular problem by bringing together the gold standard and the aluminum standard. So what I want to end with is, instead of my nightmare, I want to end with my sweet dreams, which is a sequel to the play in 3 brief acts. Act 1, Nick, we recommend that your program adopt intervention monitoring to help assess whether your interventions are leading to your desired outcomes, aka your theory of change holds. Program director, let me talk to my org's evaluation expert about this. Act 2, program director, what do you think of this proposed intervention monitoring approach? Org evaluation expert, I think we need to think about the conditions under which we are taking this work. Consults flowchart. Yes, in this situation, I think we might want to combine a replicated experiment of the invasive weed treatment with ongoing monitoring of our strategy to promote landowner adoption. Act 3, program director to Nick. We're really excited to go forward with this work. It seems both feasible and useful. End result, the program does the right assessments. We get better adaptive management and learning. Curtain closes. So that's the presentation.
Fantastic, Nick. Really interesting. And there were people already speaking in the chat quite early on going, can we get a copy of this presentation? That flowchart's brilliant. And people obviously wanting to put it into practice straight away. So fantastic. I'm going to hand straight over to Elias, who's going to chair the Q&A.
So yes, thank you very much, Nick, for this great presentation. The first question is on from Paul Ferraro. Throughout your presentation, you seem to take as a given that program staff have strong incentives to discover the truth in their own programs, which may not be true. Do you think the aluminium approach requires that users have greater willingness to engage in self-criticism and greater openness to interrogating the assumptions compared to the gold approach? So what do you think?
I think that so Paul has a lot of wisdom here, and I think that this is something that has limited adoption of any kind of monitoring and evaluation, is people don't want to look in the mirror and look at and criticize themselves or see what's going on there. I think part of what you're asking the question is, should you do first-party assessment or second or third-party assessment? But I would actually note that you could do first or second or third-party assessment with either the gold standard or the aluminum standard approach. So I think that the question of who's doing the assessment and the motivations for doing the assessment are somewhat independent of the type of approach that you do. But there's no doubt that getting people to look in the mirror is a challenge. And that's actually why, if you look at the nightmare scenario that I started this conversation with, I think that's why I get grumpy when they go to the evaluation expert and the evaluation expert says, well, it's not going to work. So then people use that as their excuse to opt out from doing anything. And that's why we have to unite and come together to stop that and really get people to realize that they need to be looking in the mirror to get better at what they do.
Yes, thank you. So I have one question which I also are wondering, back to your graph showing the drop-off in the probability of the correct decision. why is there a drop-off? Can you like explain the assumptions why there should be a drop-off and not just a flattening out of the marginal returns to investment?
Sure. Let me go back to that graph here. Let me just give me a second here. Juggling screens here. So you're asking about the drop off in this particular curve here. Yes. And what I would say here is that and I mean this is somewhat of a abstraction, this particular graph. I think the actual situation might vary from place to place. I might actually argue that this climb from B to C doesn't actually happen if all we're asking the question of does it work, and we're not figuring out a way to answer does it not work. So maybe this is actually flatter across here. But I think in general, and maybe this was also designed, for example, in the case of doing evidence synthesis, that if you do more evidence synthesis, you're more likely to uncover the truth and make the correct decision. But it gets a lot more expensive to do that more gold standard evidence synthesis using a systematic review rather than a more quick and dirty review or something over here. So, and then the reason this drops is I think that people start to confuse themselves, or they start to second guess themselves, and then it leads to planning paralysis. I think at a meta level, it would be really fun to actually test this hypothetical curve that we've articulated here and find the real world cases and sort of actually see what actually happens in the real world. And so this is in some ways a hypothesis in and of itself that could be tested. Now, I don't know whether we would test that through a control group or whether we would test that through other ways, but we can see what happens.
So you think the main mechanism is people getting confused and then it drops to zero? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So how deep do you think we should go in developing behaviorized fear of change in terms of individual or social psychology?
So I would encourage you, and I can put a link to this. There's a new website that's out there that kind of focuses on behavioral change. I'm just going to do a quick teaser for it here if I can figure out how to pull it over. So the Conservation Measures Partnership version 5.0 of the conservation standards has a lot of information now about behavior change. We sort of behaviorized change things. And if I bring this screen over, you should be able to see it. This is the new website that we've developed. It has these different behavior change levers. So it has these different frameworks. And then for each of these levers, it has a theory of change of how they operate. It has then things that could be tested. People are finding this really powerful. So each of these different levers has its own way of describing how things work. I would really encourage people to look at this. I'll send around the link. And I think that this will be huge need for testing and seeing where these things work using different kinds of approaches and different kind of modalities.
All right. So another question, is there an argument that true gold standard impact evaluation really needs to isolate the underpinning mechanisms of success or failure? It has like RCTs should use multi-arm designs that explicitly test the conditions, mechanisms that drive success, rather than just test whether organization X current program has its desired impact.
So that's a great point. And to some degree, I think for the purposes of argument, I was setting up a little bit of a straw case there where it's only looking at just the outcome and not the intermediate black box. So whoever asked that question is absolutely right. You could design those more complicated control groups that would look at those different factors. But you'll notice then the power has to go way up. I mean, then that makes the case even more difficult and tricky. And it's already hard enough and expensive enough to do some of these things. So the question is it feasible to do that kind of design and get there? And so, but I do think we have been fooled, or we've been not fooled, but we've been seduced by the medical world where things are much simpler. And in the conservation world, we have to look at these more complicated systems and then find the right design to solve those cases.
So Rachel Neugarten from WCS asks, one concern that she has is when trying to navigate evidence is that the direction of the impact of an intervention can be different from the direction of the trend, right? Or Yeah, and vice versa. While I fully agree that some monitoring and evaluation adaptive management is better than none, in some cases the information from monitoring is actually misleading. Do you have recommendations for avoiding this?
So Rachel, obviously a really good question. And I can actually see your face on the screen, so I can wave to you too. Yeah, I mean that comes down to the degree of proof that's needed in your situation. And so there's this whole question, again, if you're dealing with the last remaining population of a species, if you're doing interventions that are going to dramatically change interested parties, stakeholders' lives, if you're doing something that's really expensive, then yeah, you're going to want to invest more and double check or triple check where things are. If it goes back to that flow chart. If you're just working on a case where the stakes aren't that high and you kind of need to keep moving and you don't have a ton of budget for monitoring, then yeah, you take more of a risk. And it's always that risk of type 1 error versus type 2 error. We're never going to completely eliminate either of those, but you have to pick the right level for where you are. And so, yeah, I mean, there's obviously chances of type 1 error, and that's the risk we run. But I think conservationists are much more like, and this is an interesting case of maybe academic researchers versus people who work in the field. I think academic researchers are rightly really worried about type 1 error, claiming something's true when it's not. Conservationists are much more like firefighters. They're much more worried about missing the alarm that they should have taken some action, and they're less worried about kind of getting something wrong and looking stupid when they got it wrong. To be sure. And those are gross generalizations, but I think that's part of the exchange there. Does that make sense, Rachel? I'm curious. We should make this a little more of a conversation anyway, rather than me just kind of answering stuff.
Yes, yeah, it's difficult as we have so many, we have now 80% participants, so I would love more interactive. Yeah, so let me read out another question, right? So Hupu Gapta asks, can you talk more about who's involved in the collaborative learning process, moving from synthesis of the evidence, knowledge building, and generating wisdom? I'm mindful that each piece of that pathway is a communal exercise, and that who is part of the process will determine success.
That's a really good question. So that's about the collaborative learning. There's a lot of different models for how you would set that up, but basically, so at the highest, most generic level, you need people who are contributing the use cases. So people who are actually going out and taking their information and then contributing that to the collective learning piece. You need people to do the vetting, the synthesis, the analysis, the thinking about that work. And then you need people to communicate the results and share them back. There's a whole production process that goes on in that kind of work. One of the things that we've been really intrigued with for many years now is trying to get the consumers of the information involved in that production process. So rather than outsourcing the synthesis to some outside group of academics who then reflect the information back, drop the information back in, can we actually get folks involved in that? So many years ago, we were involved in the LMMA, Locally Managed Marine Area Network. And the idea there was to get the actual communities involved in setting up these locally managed marine areas, involved in collecting the data, but also analyzing the data and thinking about it and reflecting on it. So one model would be to create these learning networks. We've had this interest for many years of creating these learning networks or learning communities where people would come together around a topic. My colleagues in FOS Europe, Nico Bonish and others, they worked with the MAVA Foundation to create a whole bunch of different learning networks on different topics where the donor convened people and then had these conversations and this work together. But there are also we're doing work with Conservation Evidence, Bill Sutherland and his colleagues, where they're doing more of the assessments and we're doing the weighting of the evidence. Or if you look at the Panorama website that the German and IUCN have created, the Panorama website is an aggregation online of cases that people can take and analyze and that are out there. So I think there's a lot of different mechanisms or modalities for doing that learning, and they're really exciting to explore which ones work and how to make it work and how to fund it and how to pay for it. And most importantly, how to get people to use it.
So a little bit about your theory of change. There was an earlier question if you are drawing it on Nancy Cartwright's process tracing theory of change, stuff like that.
Theories of change go back many, many years. They go back to the 1970s, 1980s in the development world. And there's a whole long history of where those came from. And they've been developed sort of in different fields and in different ways. One of the interesting things that we're finding is that for many years, we in conservation seem to have envy of the health, evidence-based medicine, or envy of the theory of change and the thinking that's been done in, say, the development sector and other sectors. I think one of the really interesting things about conservation is that because we're working in such complex systems, and because we have to be doing this adaptive management, command and control doesn't work, we've actually in some ways leapfrogged ahead a little bit of some of those other fields. And now I'm getting envy from the other fields where people kind of look at what we're doing and say, hey, maybe we should apply this to personalized medicine, or maybe we should apply this to some of the development sectors. So I think that there's certainly a healthy exchange and learning from what these other fields have done, and we need to kind of keep that exchange back and forth going forward.
So another question from Professor, or maybe it's a comment, yes. So I think academic researchers are not or should not be concerned about type 1 errors because the idea that any of conservation intervention has zero effect on an outcome is typically implausible. So should we be concerned or should we about bias? It has exaggerated magnitudes and incorrect signs that end up distorting how we allocate our scarce resources. I think practitioners also care about that, at least at the collective level, if not their own project level. So again, yes, the zero effect is not the main issue, right? The main issue would be the overestimation of an effect.
For sure. And although I have to say there are plenty of cases where I've actually seen in my practice zeros. I mean, where people are just, and one of the zero effects is it goes back to that whole issue of the implementation failure. I mean, we worry so much about theory failure. Do we have the wrong intervention? But the reason we built that adaptive management, that first question, did you actually do what you said you're going to do, is so often the reason projects fail, is that they don't even get to the starting point of starting their interventions. And then you have to figure out why you didn't get to where or you're doing at such a small fraction of the scale of where you need to be. So I actually think the zero case is real, but I do take Paul's point that, obviously it's also degrees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so maybe I can jump into the cost effectiveness, right? So once you analyze the single mechanisms, right, and compare outreach against the other types of interventions, right, and you do this in an aluminium standard. So in the end, it's very hard to figure out which of these components actually have the effective marginal change, right, on the outcome. And if the knowledge base is not from previous science, right, it might be confusing to pinpoint where to better invest, no?
So I would 100% agree with you on cost effectiveness is a really critical component of this. So understanding, and this is where the economics come in, and doing kind of looking at contingencies. So we're doing a lot of economic cash flow analyses of business as usual versus some other case, and sort of seeing, and then what are the economic returns, but also what are the financial returns, what are the economic returns, what are the social returns. And so there's a whole effectiveness thing for sure in that point. But it's also worth going back, when you talked about the complexity of the system, I want to go back to Buzz Hollings and the original people who came up with adaptive management and why they came up with adaptive management, right? Adaptive management is not just trying whatever you want and then trying something else. It was deliberately designed in the context of complex systems where command and control doesn't work, that you would state your action as a hypothesis, you would implement it and test it to see whether it worked, and then you would adapt based on the results of that, because we didn't know how to proceed in complex systems. And so I think we have to embrace that complexity, wade into that swamp, and figure out how to navigate our way through it.
All right, there are many more comments. Thank you so much. I will hand over to Julia, sorry.
Fantastic. There's so much, and I hope you have a chance, Nick, to just read through all the comments in the chat at the end, because there's some really interesting questions there. And I'd like to particularly end by echoing Rachel Newgarten's point, where she said how pleased she is to see two communities come together, the Team Counterfactual and the Conservation Measures Partnership approach and community coming together in this event. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to flag before we end that next month, so the first Tuesday of the month, as it always is, will actually be a few hours early, I think 2 hours earlier, because we are very honoured to be welcoming Holly Booth, who's based in Indonesia. So to work better for the East Asian audience, Australasia audience, we are, and the speaker herself, we're moving it earlier that day. So don't forget, if you haven't yet signed up on social media and on the website to receive updates, then please do. And once again, Nick, thank you very much. That was extremely helpful. And for those of you that are asking to see the slides, etc., the video will be available. Share it far and wide. And of course, Nick's many papers and documents and writings in this area are all publicly available. So thank you again, Nick.
Thank you for the opportunity. If people stay on just real quickly, I'll pop the link to the presentation in the Zoom chat.
Oh, fantastic. That's extremely helpful. Many people have been asking for that.
Let me just pop that in.
Excellent.
Right there. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you all so much.